Sooner or later, a crisis arises in every man's life when he is confronted with his shadow. And when this happens, he cannot escape facing himself. Carl Jung. This quote from Carl Jung leads us to a profound reflection on what he called the shadow, a central part of his analytical psychology. The shadow represents everything we prefer not to see or recognize in ourselves. These are aspects of our personality that, for one reason or another, we repress, deny, or avoid, because they don't conform to the social or moral expectations we have adopted. It includes impulses, desires, weaknesses, and even traumas that we can't consciously integrate. But what does it really mean to encounter the shadow? This concept is not just an abstract idea. Jung believed that confronting our shadow is one of the most crucial stages on the path to individuation, the process of becoming fully who you are. The shadow, when ignored, manifests itself in distorted ways, usually by projecting itself onto others. This means that often what we criticize in others, or the characteristics we despise in others, are actually mirrors of our own shadow, parts of ourselves that we haven't yet accepted. Facing the shadow can be scary and uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Jung said that the key to self-understanding and personal growth is to bring the shadow into the light of consciousness. Ignoring the shadow can result in an incomplete life, marked by frustrations, internal conflicts, and unconscious behaviors that sabotage our personal fulfillment. In this script, we will explore the concept of the shadow in depth, understanding how it forms, how we can recognize it, and most importantly, how to face it. Acceptance of the shadow, although challenging, opens the way to true inner freedom. It is a process of reconciliation with our darker sides, where we find new power over our lives, allowing us to live more authentically and less conditioned by unconscious forces. At the end of this journey, the viewer will understand that, in order to achieve fullness, it is essential that we look at what is darkest within us. That is where the potential for transformation and healing lies. Carl Jung developed the concept of the shadow as one of the pillars of his analytical psychology, seeing it as the dark counterpart of the conscious ego. For him, the shadow contains everything that, for different reasons, has been excluded from our consciousness throughout personal development. It is made up of aspects of the personality that do not align with the image we wish to maintain of ourselves or that society approves of, and are therefore repressed and thrown into the unconscious. The shadow is a universal part of the human psyche. We all have this hidden face, made up of thoughts, emotions, desires, and impulses that we prefer not to recognize. From an early age, we are conditioned to follow social and cultural norms, learning what is acceptable or moral. In this way, we learn to disguise and hide what we think is inadequate, incapable, or weak. But for Jung, what we reject doesn't disappear. Instead, the repressed contents go into the shadow, where they continue to influence our lives in subtle and often destructive ways. This constant repression creates an internal imbalance. The conscious ego tries to maintain control, while the repressed contents in the shadow seek recognition, emerging in moments of anger, envy, fear, destructive impulses, or harsh judgments about others. The more we try to avoid or repress our shadow, the more power it acquires. Jung said that in the process of individuation, the path to wholeness and self-knowledge, it is essential to face this hidden part of the psyche. The process of individuation is a complex journey that seeks to integrate all parts of our personality, both conscious and unconscious. Without the integration of the shadow, individuation remains incomplete. One of the biggest challenges is that the shadow, being unconscious, is not easy to recognize. It manifests itself mainly through projections, when we attribute to others the defects, fears, or behaviors that belong to ourselves. When we get excessively annoyed or irritated by certain characteristics in other people, it is usually a sign that we are seeing something of our own shadow in them. This process of identification and recognition is the first step towards the integration of the shadow, which, according to Jung, leads to true freedom and self-understanding. To better understand how the shadow affects our daily lives, let's look at some practical examples. Imagine a person who, in their childhood, was taught to repress their anger. Perhaps their parents told them that good girls don't get angry, or strong boys don't cry. Throughout his life, he internalized this message, and whenever he felt angry or frustrated, he repressed it, believing that these feelings were unacceptable. As a result, these feelings were pushed into the shadows. Years later, this person becomes an adult who apparently never shows anger. However, they begin to notice that in certain situations, they react disproportionately, perhaps exploding in moments of stress or becoming excessively angry at behavior they consider irresponsible in other people. What's happening here is the projection of their shadow. The repressed anger now manifests itself in episodes of uncontrollability or through condemnation of others who seem to express emotions that they themselves can't handle. Another example would be a person who has repressed their desire for independence and individuality because they grew up in an environment where conformity and obedience were highly valued. This person may unconsciously begin to criticize those who make bold decisions or live independently because deep down they would like to do so themselves, but don't feel they have permission to do so. The shadow in this case takes the form of frustration disguised as moral judgment. These examples show that as long as we don't recognize the shadow, it unconsciously controls our reactions, causing us to perpetuate destructive patterns of behavior. When the shadow is not confronted, projections can cause disagreements and interpersonal conflicts, disrupting relationships and generating unnecessary stress. The solution, however, is not simple. Jung suggested that, in order to integrate the shadow, it takes courage and honesty to look inside and recognize what has been repressed. This doesn't mean accepting or acting on these dark impulses, but recognizing them as parts of our psyche. The process of bringing these parts to consciousness allows us to become less reactive and more aware of our patterns. Only by accepting our shadow can we avoid its pitfalls and start walking the path of individuation with clarity. Integrating the shadow is an ongoing process that involves, first and foremost, a radical acceptance of who we are, including what we least like to recognize in ourselves. By accepting the shadow, we begin a process of deep healing. But what does this acceptance really mean? And how does it relate to inner freedom? For Jung, accepting the shadow is not the same as giving in to its destructive impulses. On the contrary, it is the act of consciously recognizing these repressed parts of our psyche, understanding that they are part of us. We can only control them if we are aware of their existence. When we ignore our shadow, we are at the mercy of its unconscious effects. However, by bringing it into the light of consciousness, we can integrate it in a healthy way, redirecting its energy towards a higher purpose. Jung also observed that the process of individuation, which aims at the totality of being, cannot be achieved without this integration of the shadow. He believed that the collective unconscious, the vast reservoir of memories and experiences shared by all of humanity, plays an important role in this process. The personal shadow is influenced by universal archetypes, such as the enemy or the monster, which symbolize the dark side of the psyche. These archetypes show us that the shadow is not an isolated phenomenon. It is rooted in ancient and primordial patterns that all human beings share. This is why, in mythologies from various cultures, we find the figure of the hero who must face a dragon or a monster in order to achieve true transformation. This monster is not just an external threat. It symbolizes the internal struggle we all face against the dark aspects of our psyche. Facing and accepting the shadow frees us from the illusions we create about ourselves. When we stop projecting our fears and weaknesses onto others, we can see the world more clearly and relate more authentically to those around us. This inner freedom allows us to act more consciously, without being constantly manipulated by unconscious impulses. In fact, many of our internal and external conflicts stem from the fear of confronting the shadow. By facing it, we pave the way for a more integrated, authentic, and free life, because true freedom can only come about when we accept all parts of ourselves, both the light and the dark. Carl Jung offers us a transformative vision of human nature by inviting us to face our shadow. He teaches us that inner freedom and personal growth cannot be achieved without first looking at what is most hidden within us. Accepting the shadow is accepting the totality of who we are, with all our imperfections, repressed impulses, and frailties. It's a difficult and often uncomfortable process, but it brings a deep sense of fulfillment and completion. Many of us spend our lives trying to get away from our weaknesses, fears, and imperfections, believing that this will make us stronger or more socially acceptable. But, as Jung points out, true strength comes from integration, not denial. Those who are able to look at themselves with honesty and courage end up discovering that the qualities they fear the most are also sources of great power. Repressed anger, for example, when recognized, can be transformed into an assertive and creative force. The fear of rejection can teach us to seek deeper and more authentic connections. In this sense, the process of individuation, the path to becoming who we really are, is a path of reconciliation with what we have repressed. By illuminating the dark parts of our psyche, we free ourselves from destructive projections and make room for a more conscious and balanced life. As Jung observed, he who looks out dreams. He who looks in awakens. This inner journey, although challenging, is the path to awakening the true self. The shadow then ceases to be an enemy to be feared and becomes a powerful ally in the process of self-discovery. The more we accept and integrate these hidden aspects of our personality, the closer we come to a fulfilling life. Acceptance of the shadow is ultimately acceptance of ourselves as complete human beings, imperfect but constantly evolving. Jung's invitation is for each of us to embark on this journey of self-exploration and transformation. He reminds us that by facing our inner darkness, we find a light that is rightfully ours, and by accepting that light, we gain true freedom, the freedom to be who we really are, without fear, without masks, and with a deep sense of purpose. That's the final message I'd like to leave you with. The shadow is an integral part of our psyche, and it's only by confronting it that we can discover our true essence. It's not about eliminating the darkness, but integrating it so that we can shine more fully.